Welcome to the MRO Exchange, Connecting Healthcare Executives, your go-to podcast for staying informed in the dynamic healthcare world, where MRO discusses industry trends and topics with prominent healthcare leaders. In each episode, we delve into the intricate landscape of the U.S. healthcare system, shining a light on the immense responsibility shouldered by providers to effectively acquire, manage, and share clinical data with data consumers. Join MRO experts and healthcare executives as they navigate the important dynamics within this highly complex environment. From the surge in healthcare ecosystem demands to the influx of structured and unstructured data scattered across diverse systems, along with the ever-growing compliance, security, and privacy expectations, the MRO Exchange, Connecting Healthcare Executives, unravels it all for you. Tune in for a comprehensive exploration of the pressing issues shaping the healthcare industry today.
Hi, my name is Anthony Murray, Chief Interoperability Officer for MRO, and thank you for tuning into The Exchange, where we connect healthcare executives. You can learn more about me and my background on the MRO website, mrocorp.com, and please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Today, I'm here to connect with Cyrus Bahrassa, founder and CEO of Ashevin, and Lydia Wardi, Senior Counsel for MRO, and we're going to be discussing all things operability. Today, we'll focus on setting the table and a foundation for future episodes where we'll go a little bit deeper into various themes. So for our inaugural Interop 101 session, please welcome Cyrus and Lydia. And let's start by having each of you introduce yourselves. And Lydia, would you mind going first?
Absolutely. Lydia Wardi, Senior Counsel with MRO. Absolutely thrilled to be here. Thank you, Anthony.
Thanks, Lydia. Cyrus, tell us a little bit about you and Ashevin.
Hey, everybody. I'm Cyrus Bahrassa, founder and CEO of Ashevin. We are a healthcare interoperability consulting company with a mission to make the best choice the easiest one, and proud to be a close partner with MRO.
Thanks. Appreciate you guys joining me today again, and for all of your help and guidance as we continue to navigate the changing landscape of healthcare and tapping into the power of interoperability in order to achieve our mission of advancing clinical data exchange. We're very proud of our ability to balance technology with the privacy and security controls that are required in order to exchange information. So a lot to unpack in interoperability. So in order to help set that foundation, Cyrus, can you just give us a little bit of a background on, what is interoperability? What has gone on in the past to bring us to a point where we wind up with something like the 21st Century Cures Act and concepts like TEFCA, when there was already people exchanging healthcare information in various ways?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the story of healthcare interoperability is probably longer than most people realize, and also messier than most people realize. So you can go back to the 70s and 80s when we had various different standards that were coming into play. Things like NCPDP for the exchange of prescription drug information, as well as HL7V2, which is the, sort of tried and true standard for healthcare data interfaces that came out in the late 80s. And then, other standards like X12, DICOM, et cetera. But those standards and that type of exchange that was sort of envisioned and in use at that time was very much point to point. So you had this amalgam of individual connections between systems that you had to constantly rebuild and maintain. Think about, a single hospital, for example, needing to build lab interfaces with lab systems, DICOM interfaces with PACS systems for radiology and cardiology, prescription, related integrations over NCPDP with the different pharmacies and other entities. So you have all these, different connections where the main hospital and probably their EHR becomes the hub. And then there's countless spokes that are coming out of that you're trying to all keep in sync. And if you want to establish a new connection at a new hospital, well, you start that process all over again. And you have to know exactly who to work with. You have to set up individualized VPNs and other types of connections, et cetera. So it's very much a fragmented and an individualized kind of approach to healthcare technology and healthcare interoperability. You see some shifts in terms of moving towards a network-based approach to interoperability. I'd say in the 2000s or so. Surely there are some people who are doing it earlier, but I know that some major health information exchanges that we've seen, such as CRISP in Maryland, HealthX in New York, those kind of arose in the 2000s, where there's this approach of trying to be more of a network, trying to have more of a web of connections between systems and do a better job of data aggregation and do a better job of identifying and finding records for patients. So this allows you to sort of build that not hub and spoke, but more of that map, if you will, and that multi-point, nodal framework, if I can use a very fancy terminology. So that's something where, great, we now have a little bit better approach to how we handle this. But again, it's kind of not the greatest. It's not as good as it could be because you have to opt in, you have to be a participant in that process, and you have the power of these networks is only as much as many people participate. So you have to have that buy-in and participation to really get somewhere with that. And even then, these health information exchanges often were regional or statewide. So there's still a fragmentation layer here where you still got individualized HIEs and health information networks that can only cover a certain geographic area. So we still have this problem of fragmentation that we've got to overcome and try to get to something truly national.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in there, and thank you for pulling together like the history of the world in 5 minutes or less. Like all good healthcare conversations, there was a lot of acronyms used in there for various purposes. We're not going to bring out the lexicon or the Rosetta Stone to figure out all of those pieces, but a couple of them really popped out to me, which is the technology and the concepts have been out there for a long time. And when we think about how slow it takes sometimes for healthcare technology to pick up, I feel like we popped out of COVID and it was like interoperability was happening. I don't know if you kind of felt the same way. It was like we went away, we quarantined. It was actually like an incubator to make more of this happen. And I feel like there's an acceleration even without the pressures, although it was certainly an enabler of some of the things that came out from, the final rule that we'll be talking about in a minute. Lydia, how did we get to a point where the Cures Act was necessary, and what types of things did it bring out and push, into regulations that has created like an initial spark and another HIE or HIN to try and take a swing at getting us to a point that Cyrus was talking about, being able to exchange ubiquitously across like a national network or a network of networks?
Absolutely. So as Cyrus alluded to, the healthcare landscape with respect to interoperability has long been fragmented, with providers having myriad technology interfaces, limitations. There just is basically the Cures Act was born out of the inability to properly transmit health information. And that seems at this point like, well, we all know that. We all know this is a problem. But Congress and the federal government generally came to the recognition that there can be no value-based care in the absence of real-time meaningful data. So if we think about the federal government, even just last year, 2023, almost 37% of Americans had public health insurance coverage. So the government is motivated to drive value and knows that data is the linchpin to that. So the Cures Act was passed in 2016, almost unanimously by Congress with wide bipartisan support. And it really has three primary tenets. The first is the Act requires patients to be able to access all of their electronic health information The Cures Act required the healthcare industry to adopt standard application programming interfaces, APIs, to basically allow patients to access their electronic health information using their smartphone. So the first was APIs without special effort, giving patients the ability to access their information on the technological modality that many have, cell phone. That was one. The second, TEFCA. And just to dive into TEFCA at a very high level, TEFCA really is getting at what Cyrus was drilling in on, that TEFCA is intended to create a universal framework and set of standards that providers can share information. So the idea was, as Cyrus said, there are an infinite number of portals, connections, et cetera, that providers currently use, and those connections aren't interoperable. So the idea was, we will create a national universal standard where everyone is operating off of the same platform, essentially, and so that information can be exchanged seamlessly. I think the best analogy for me that I've heard with TEFCA is analogizing the aim of TEFCA to how modern day cell phone interoperability works. So let's say I have Sprint, my dad has AT&T, we have different carriers, but I don't need to enter into an agreement with AT&T to be able to call my dad. So the idea is everything works together seamlessly without burdensome intervention, connecting, et cetera. So that's TEFCA very broadly. The one thing about TEFCA I just want to emphasize quickly is that TEFCA is not itself a technology, but TEFCA isn't a platform in and of itself. It's a baseline set of standards that everyone is intended to buy into for sharing of information. Also, another, I thought, great point by Cyrus is the viability of TEFCA is only as good as the participation. So the ability to have end-to-end sharing of information between providers necessitates providers to join TEFCA. And right now, participation is a moving target. The government's trying to incentivize and encourage TEFCA participation. And there are some industry concerns, considerations, reservations that are still being worked through. The final third prong of the Cures Act is the prohibition on information blocking. High level, when we think about protected health information, when we think about medical records, they're outside of the infrastructure limitations and fragmentation across the country. There's also some anti-competitive concerns that are layered on top of that certain industry players don't want to share information with their cohort because that information is valuable. So the Cures Act, the final tenet, was intended to really regulate and crack down on information blocking so that the competitive or gamesmanship angle of this paradigm would not hamper the overall effort.
So it sounds like there's some optionality that's baked in, unlike the calls to your father. You probably have to pick those up regardless of your contractual status with him. But that creates, I guess, a mystery on how well and how fast and who all of the participants will be. So I think there's a lot of activity about trying to really understand or just get a clearer picture on, who's going to be sharing, what's going to be sharing, how it's going to be shared, and through what parties do you have to share through. So Cyrus, another acronym, like what is TEFCA and how do we kind of like tear it apart to get into this flurry of activity now that we're starting to see around some of these entities that are participating?
Yeah, so TEFCA is really two things, two parts. The first three letters, TEF, is the Trusted Exchange Framework, and then the last two letters, the Common Agreement. So the Trusted Exchange Framework is basically a set of principles, an idealized sort of list of things that we want to pursue or establish with regards to nationwide health information exchange. So things like following standards, operating transparently, and prioritizing things like equity and access to information for public health purposes. So the general sort of principles, they don't necessarily have a lot of meat or binding qualities to them, though, in that sense. So that's where the common agreement comes into play. That is an actual legal document that certain organizations called QHINs would sign on to, and these are actual legal, requirements that they must follow. This is an extensive agreement, something that's gone through a couple iterations. We're on version 2 now. I'm sure, attorneys like Lydia love, sitting on the beach and reading these sorts of things. This is how they pass their time. Me, not so much, but I do know that it's got quite a few different ins and outs. And I want to just, go back to something that Lydia said that I think was important in terms of the motivations of Congress. So this is back in 2016 when the Cures Act was passed. The phase I skipped over in my earlier comments was the meaningful use phase, where we had Congress providing money to organizations to incentivize them to utilize electronic health records. But that usage of the EHRs, for the most part, didn't focus on the interoperability aspects. It was focused more on the clicks and filling out the right fields and capturing the right data points, to be able to be considered a meaningful user. But then as a result, the interoperability side sort of, was a secondary thought or an afterthought. So that's how we got to where Lydia was talking about, where Congress felt like more legislation was necessary to actually make health information exchange front and center in terms of importance.
So, like, did they just magic this stuff up? Did they take any lessons learned? It sounds like TEFCA and the QHINs, these qualified health information networks, in your opinion, are they advancing the ball? Are they redoing what's already been out there? Is there any commentary on like how did they come up with like what is in the trusted exchange framework and what are the controls built into the common agreement compared to some of the other exchanges that existed before then?
Yeah, I think a couple things I would say there. TEFCA is a good thing, first of all, at least in my opinion. It's important that we have this effort for nationwide information exchange. It's important that we're thinking on a national scale, and I think that we are doing that. So establishing these different rules of the road, establishing these different details around what's appropriate to exchange and not to appropriate to exchange is all a good thing. On the flip side, from a technology, like a core technology perspective, and I'm going to nerd out here for a second, but TEFCA is not doing anything necessarily, groundbreaking or pioneering from a technology perspective. If anything, they're still kind of, keeping the same approach as before in terms of leveraging some older technology frameworks to be able to exchange data, using things like older SOAP web services, which are just harder to implement, not scalable, not something that you associate with modern 21st century technology that other industries and other companies like Amazon and Meta and such are using. So that's where we still have a challenge and we still have to upgrade the technology. Now, you could argue the approach that we're taking is the right one because this allows organizations that are built to use that older technology to participate from day one. And that's certainly an advantage, but can't wait to see us adopt things like FHIR, adopt more robust data exchange. And then to the participation question, also, getting a wider variety of participants and sub-participants, because it's important that we have a whole bunch of people involved, not just providers, but payers, public health agencies, pharmacies, other just entities, because our healthcare data traverses just the four walls of a healthcare system.
Yeah, I think you brought up a lot of great points. I'm a fan of what they're trying to do, as a goal of our organization. Helping to accelerate clinical data exchange falls in line with creating mechanisms and ecosystems where that information can be exchanged easily. I appreciate the intent to take on the guidance from ONC to adopt FHIR. I think that the only way to really introduce this, I agree, was taking advantage of what was already in place as a stepping stone and as an enabler to get some legs up under the QHIN networks to originate.
Well, Anthony, one of the things that you said, I just want to double click, as you would say, on your point in terms of how is the government taking into account industry feedback on TEFCA? And the industry is very vocal in terms of providers, payers, other healthcare stakeholders really wanting to understand not only how the program is intended to work in a future utopian state, but more tangibly, how's it working now? And along the lines of the anti-competitive concerns, there are a lot of questions regarding QHINs, what they're doing with the data. Back-end validation needs to be done to ensure that the data is being used for the purpose that it was purported to be used. So even right now, there is the HTI-2 notice of proposed rulemaking, and commenters who've submitted their their comments thus far have been very pointed in their questions and wanting really the rigor of compliance, oversight, enforcement to make sure that data is not being misused. And to me, broadly, that's one of, I think, the biggest general concerns is this information being misused? And if so, by whom and in what way? So there's some areas of gray that I think the government prompted to address even more meaningfully than they have in responding to HTI-2, the notice of proposed rulemaking.
Because it's timely, are there any nuggets in there in either of your opinions that make the transition from HTI-1 to HTI-2 and what changes people should be on the lookout depending on what they're interested in?
Absolutely. So they have a slew of information blocking proposals that really are intended to make information blocking more knowable, better to comply with. And then there is also a great number of TEFCA proposals, most of which are specific to QHINs, regulation of QHINs, monitoring of QHINs. So like that's a perfect example of the government hearing the industry refrain on concerns and then trying to address those concerns via rulemaking and adding some checks and balances, safeguards. So I would say if you have an ability to check out the HTI-2 NPRM information blocking and TEFCA proposals, there's a wealth of information there.
It even goes beyond TEFCA with various different updates related to USCDI, which is the U.S. Core Data for Interoperability, basically the floor for which data elements should be exchangeable through FHIR APIs, as well as some really interesting changes and new approaches by the ONC or ASTP around public health and payers, and actually introducing new certification programs for data exchange for those entities and those purposes. So this is sort of a broadening of the agency's scope and their, the areas that they cover. Historically, they've just certified health information technology from the perspective of like EHRs. And now we're getting into systems that relate to public health as well as payer-related data exchange for reasons like prior authorization. So it'll be very interesting to see, how that comes together Also, I don't think we have time today per se, but very interested to hear Lydia's thoughts on whether this is even something that's going to be allowed, and how recent decisions by the Supreme Court may make it more challenging for the federal government to broaden the scope of their work and what they can do, like we're seeing here with this HTI 2 rule. So I'm eager to see how this plays out and eager to hear other people's opinions on it.
Absolutely. And that's another very timely development, really, in regulated industries in general, but for us, in terms of this interoperability discussion. In June 2024, the United States Supreme Court issued a landmark decision that is being referred to as Loper. Loper was one of the parties in the action, but basically the import of the Loper case was that it overturned 40-year standing precedent that was known as the Chevron doctrine or Chevron deference. Bottom line, with Loper, now courts are prohibited from deferring to administrative agencies in their interpretation of statutory provisions that are ambiguous, or where there's silence where Congress hadn't spoken on it. So before, under Chevron, a court had to defer to an agency's interpretation as to the statute. And now we're in a Loper environment, and that means that a court is prohibited from deferring to an agency on interpretation. So what does that mean? This whole Loper implication arises in the context of a challenge to rulemaking. So when an executive agency creates a rule and that rule is subsequently challenged, that when someone in the industry brings a legal challenge calling into question that rule, the great impact of Loper is now the agency is disadvantaged, and it really puts leverage in the moving party. The party bringing the claim has more leverage because the agency is no longer given the same credence. So what that means for us is, in terms of HHS rulemaking on TEFCA, on interoperability, on information blocking, that rulemaking is now more vulnerable to legal challenges, and there's a greater likelihood that upon a legal challenge, such rulemaking will be struck down. So there's a lot of activity, and we're very interested to see how Loper plays out in the TEFCA interoperability information blocking context.
Has there been any meaningful activity around this in or outside of healthcare where we're starting to see some questioning of where somebody is interpreting the government's lawmaking as overreaching and trying to enact this? Or are we like holding our breath for the first one to kind of kick over?
Absolutely. So there, since the Loper decision, there's been a flurry of activity across different industries, and most recently specific to healthcare, and most impactful to MRO and our clients. HHS, their reproductive health privacy final rule was challenged just over 2 weeks ago, and that rule will be subject to Loper scrutiny. So that's a great contemporary example of how this is playing out, quote unquote, in real life.
It's fascinating. I think somebody like early on when it happened was basically, Cyrus, I think you said that the lawyers are like lining up on the beach. This is them lining up in the movie theater, grabbing their popcorn and like ready to watch the show go down. So I think it is going to be super interesting to see it in our space. The way that reproductive rights was written was problematic. It was hard to operationalize. So hopefully, just with even the conversation going back out, the fact that it's being held up and looked at, maybe we can get some better clarity so we can really figure out how we can implement and make the intent of that law more achievable than as it was currently written. Out of it, even if it slows us down a little bit.
Absolutely. And the other thing just that I think is helpful in a regulated context. So the other piece that Loper was intended to remediate was the wide swings in rulemaking, interpretation of law, when there was a change in presidential administration. So us, especially in healthcare, when a new president took charge, we, even over the past several administrations, have seen wide swings in certain laws mean, what HIPAA means, what the Social Security Act means. So Loper was intended to also stabilize and check the wide swings in interpretation that have been a great challenge in the healthcare space, really, for the last 50 years.
Cyrus, you looked like you wanted to say something there.
Not really, other than, there's still a lot more to be figured out. This whole interoperability history, as I mentioned earlier, has been messy. It will continue to be messy. You look at TEFCA and how is it going to play out? How much is it actually going to be used? I mean, yes, we have data exchange happening today. We have 7 of those QHINs that are officially designated and that are, exchanging data with more, hopefully on the way. I know that we've got a couple of organizations that are applying and going through that process. But how many people are actually going to participate? Will they just be providers, or will we see payers and those other entities that I mentioned come into play? What will the limits on federal rulemaking turn out to be as we navigate this Loper era? And what is this going to mean as well for the technology side? What new technologies will we see? What new adoption of FHIR and other types of data exchange will we see? And then the outcomes. At the end of the day, why do we do all this stuff? Hopefully to make our people, our patients healthier, to improve lives, to make our processes more efficient. Will we actually see that or not? Again, I'm optimistic. I think TEFCA is a good thing. It's not a panacea, though. It's not something that's going to solve all our problems. It's simply a tool in the interoperability toolbox. So we've got to be realistic about that. And we got to, try and make it the best as we can, given the constraints that we have.
Really well said. And, I'm encouraged that I think it was even as recent as yesterday on the Government Affairs Roundtable for Sequoia that they also, I don't know that they gave an actual number or named any names, but they do say that there is a queue for QHIN interested parties, people going through the process. So, it's 5, 7, we'll see how many it winds up being, but I think interest across a variety of landscape of the players that are operating. I don't know if it makes it any more likely to succeed or not, but it keeps that conversation going. And if we can continue to talk about how do we get this right with all of a variety of key players, I think that's our best chance to do it as united. And this is a great way to unite people, even if it doesn't manifest itself exactly as the way TEFCA's written today. We have so much that we could go into, and we covered a ton of ground already. We will probably try a slightly more targeted approach when we pick up one of our next editions. So hopefully that you can find some time to tune in for our future shows on the exchange. We will be continuing this interoperability story. We'll pepper in some history and continue to try and draw out relevant facts for things that are just moving quickly. It's almost every other day we see some other tidbit, another news story, another proposal, commentary, technology slants, participation changes. So very dynamic space. I just echo what Cyrus said, and I know that Lydia feels, which is at the end of the day, we want to get this stuff right because we want to just continue to improve care and make it easier to support a well-running healthcare ecosystem in the United States. So it's a really exciting time, and it feels like we're at the beginning of something again, which is a kind of a fun place to be. Lydia, Cyrus, any last minute flares, smoke signals, hand grenades that you'd like to launch before we wrap it up today?
I think the only thing that I really want to emphasize is that MRO wants to understand what our clients think about these things. And I know Anthony and I have been attended events, and we've gleaned so much scratch, so to speak, just by having informal conversations. So to the extent that you're listening and you're a client, we want to hear from you. We'd love to hear your questions, your pain points, concerns, things that you'd like to see. We want to be a partner in advancing the ball here. And we want to use our government and industry contacts to elevate any thoughts that our clients have. So do not hesitate to reach out to us, because your interpretation and your experience really animates this for us. So we'd love to hear from you.
And I'll just say, soak it all in. If you have any stake in this, if you have any interest in this, which I think, one way or the other, all of us have some kind of piece to play in all of this. Take an interest in it, learn about it, listen to podcasts about it. Shameless plug for the exchange, because this is important stuff, and it's going to be the wave of the future. It may not be as sexy as artificial intelligence. AI really dominates the headlines, but interoperability is where the important work gets done, and it's going to be something really special to watch.
Yeah, I think that's super well said. And there's a lot of content that's happening in real time that's out there. So if you're trying to figure out like where to get started, what's a good place, how do you participate, again, feel free to connect to Lydia or myself over LinkedIn. If you're interested in how we're using some of the tools and technology that have really been pushed forward by these types of initiatives, and even with the help of some of the government pressure, and how we're taking advantage of that in order to drive a continued quality around how we exchange information on behalf of our customers. We'd love to have those conversations as well. So join us again on a future episode of The Exchange, and stay tuned for the continuing interoperability story as it unfolds right before our eyes. Thanks again, Lydia and Cyrus, for joining me and being my guests today. And goodbye to all of our listeners. Thanks for tuning in.
You've been listening to the MRO Exchange, where we connect healthcare execs. For more insights and to hear other healthcare executives' exchanges, visit the show's page on MROcorp.com, and be sure to explore additional resources and thought leadership articles. You can also check out the program page on healthcarenowradio.com. Finally, be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn or X at MRO Corp. Until we talk again, this is the MRO Exchange, where healthcare execs connect.